Hey everybody, it's Etienne Stott here, Olympic champion from London 2012 and member of Extinction Rebellion. And this video is going to be a kind of slightly longer explanation of what I did in the most recent protest action that I undertook, and a bit about why, and a sort of comment on some of the criticisms, or some kind of address to some of the criticisms that you might hear. I'm going to, it'll probably be fairly long. I'm guessing about half an hour. I don't think it's going to be very interesting, so you're more than welcome just to listen to the audio rather than just watch me talking. But welcome if you're joining me, and thank you. And I hope that you find it interesting and maybe informative. And let's just see where we go. So first of all, what I did. So the other day, several rebels and we stopped a Shell oil tanker, fuel tanker, on its way out of the petrol station, at a petrol station near Hyde Park in London. And I climbed on top of it with another rebel, and we basically waited until the police arrived, and the police arrived and a small crowd of people gathered, and while the people were there we were talking to people and chatting to people, waving at the open top buses that went past, and the people on the back who were actually very often waving and putting their thumbs up. And eventually the police arrested us and took me away to the police station, and I stayed in the police station for about 14 hours and was let out in the early hours of the morning. Met with some nice rebels who were always waiting outside the police stations where rebels are being held, to give them biscuits and say hello, check everything's all right. And I'm what's called released under investigation, and that means I don't have a charge. I was arrested for willful obstruction of the highway and tampering with a motor vehicle. But I was released under investigation, meaning with no bail conditions, meaning I'm free to do what I want, within reason, obviously. And at some point, the police may decide to charge me, and then I will have to go to court and see what happens from there. So the question is why I did this. So the reason why is, I suppose there's two main reasons. First of all is to try to slow down just for a moment these fossil fuel companies. These fossil fuel companies like Shell are knowingly continuing with their business model, which is known to be destructive of our planet. It's destroying our planet. It's destroying the lives of millions of people all around the world right now, and destroying lives in the future that we are hoping to have. It's destroying the future of the people who are not even born yet, who are going to have to live with the consequences of the actions of these companies. And these companies know it. They know what they're doing. They're making an absolute fortune right now, but they always are making a fortune. They spend absolutely millions and millions on PR and science. For example, Shell spend as much money on PR, which mostly includes films of wind turbines and solar panels and stuff, as they actually spend on wind turbines and solar panels. So they spend an awful lot of money trying to convince us that they are doing a green business, when in fact they're doing anything but it's a tiny proportion of what they're actually up to. So these companies are destroying our future, and they know it, and they're continuing to profit from it. So to me, that is totally wrong. So trying to slow that down just for a moment, to try to pause. And I'll come to a bit about disruption later, but disruption is really critical. It's called direct action. It's trying to make the most direct difference that you can to make some changes happen. So that's the first reason. The second reason is also to create a sort of psychological or kind of social disruption, to create some sort of stir, a fuss, maybe even some outrage, if you want to use those words. And in so doing, there's an idea that that will create a space where a discussion can happen. Because people will be like, oh, that's terrible behaviour, and that's really bad. But then someone might say, well, hold on, but they do have a point. And in this case, there's lots of points you can make, but I think probably the most important point I would make is, why is our government choosing to expand fossil fuel infrastructure, fossil fuel projects, so North Sea gas and oil, at a time when the United Nations and the International Energy Agency have said that that is a very bad idea if we're trying to keep below 1.5 degrees of overheating. And even more stronger words have been used. So Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, the highest level diplomat in the world, probably got to his being in that job by being very diplomatic. He actually he said, expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure at this time, and I quote at this point, is moral and economic madness. Okay? So we as a society, me as a person, are asking people watching this and people out there, whatever you think of whatever we've done, whatever you think of what's going on, we should be asking that question of ourselves and to each other, and most importantly our government. Why is our government doing the exact opposite of what the United Nations is telling them? And the answer, I believe, is corruption. Our government, in fact our whole economy, our whole life, is we're in a stranglehold with these fossil fuel companies. And our government, in the most recent energy strategy that it announced, just 3 days after Antonio Guterres said that this was a moral and economic madness, just a few days after that, it announced, lo and behold, an expansion in fossil fuels. And it explained about the fact that it was going to expand offshore wind, which is a good form of renewable energy to many people, arguably. But it decided not to expand onshore renewables, which are the cheapest. And one of the reasons they're cheap is because they're quick to put in. They don't take much effort to put in, and they would actually help with our prices. They would help with our energy supply. And I'll come to a little bit more to kind of why now and all that in a moment. They also went in favour. In fact, no, let me just come back to that. So onshore renewables, the British public are hugely in favour of renewables. It's just a small proportion of the Tory party and people close, ministers and things like that, who are dead set against it. They bottled it because it was apparently in the strategy, and after pressure from a certain number of people, it was taken out. And they've also made a big fanfare of nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy is the most expensive form of so-called low-carbon energy. It takes a long time to commission a nuclear reactors. Even these so-called small nuclear reactors that they're talking about, it takes a long time for them to come on stream, and the electricity that is produced is expensive. Now, these figures, you can probably check, but this is my understanding. Just to illustrate, so nuclear power costs around over £90 per megawatt hour. This is what the government has to pay to get this electricity. It costs £90 an hour per megawatt hour. Offshore renewables, £37 per megawatt hour. So that's well below half of what nuclear energy costs. And onshore renewables, around about £32 per megawatt hour. So this is a huge gulf of difference, and I would suggest, and they also suggested to expand the oil and gas fields in the North Sea. So I would suggest that shows, because they had one thing that they could really do, which was really cheap and easy to do, which is to put onshore renewables. The second thing that they could have really done, which is super cheap and easy, which is also creating thousands upon thousands of good quality jobs, which would boost our economy in all different ways, would be to create a massive retrofitting scheme for our houses. This would be insulation, perhaps changing people's boilers. The real thing here is that would reduce demand, so it would reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So one of these strange things that you're hearing is that they want to expand fossil fuels to somehow make more money and to allow a transition away from fossil fuels. It makes no sense. So anyway, the real point of this question that we're trying to ask is why, open this space up. Why is our government doing the opposite of what it should be doing? And the demand that Extinction Rebellion have, we have kind of, it's called 3 immediate demands, and this was to end new fossil fuel investments, so no new fossil fuel investments, an end to fossil fuel subsidies, and to grant no new fossil fuel licenses. Those things are basically, they're not about going backwards in time. These are things you could do like literally tomorrow or the day after, and basically stop expanding fossil fuels. Interesting fact here as well is in an article in the journal Nature suggests, and this is the thing that really is super hard to get your head around. It says 60% of the world's fossil fuels that are in existing, that are accessible in existing coal fields, oil fields, gas fields, 60% of that needs to remain in the ground for us to stay below 1.5 degrees. So we've got basically far more than enough to kill ourselves, to boost ourselves over the 1.5 degrees of overheating, already at our fingertips. This is already coal, oil and gas already waiting to be exploited, already with like the taps in, ready to come out. And we have to keep that in the ground if we're going to stay below 1.5. So expanding fossil fuels is completely not sensible. And it doesn't make economic sense either, because at some point the penny is going to drop here. We're going to realise that we cannot do fossil fuels anymore. It's going to destroy us. And then what's going to happen is that all the companies that are investing in all this stuff are going to go, oh, hold on, we've just spent millions upon millions doing, making new oil rigs and exploring here, there and everywhere, and all of a sudden those things are going to be wiped out as investments. They're going to be worth nothing. And we're already seeing, it's more difficult for companies to get insurance for fossil fuel projects, for example. But all these things need to be accelerated in what's called a rapid transition. So our demands, just to come back to that, our demand is for an immediate end to new fossil fuel money. And then people are often asking, what is the solution? What solution do you want? So I've talked about onshore renewables, offshore renewables, nuclear. Do I know everything about them? No, I don't. Do I know detailed analysis of every single bit pieces? No, I don't. I'm not a nuclear engineer. I'm not an offshore renewable engineer. I'm a former canoeist. But that doesn't matter, because Extinction Rebellion are not demanding to be told, asked for the solutions. We're not going to write the policies. I want what's called a citizens' assembly. And a citizens' assembly is a group of ordinary people, a cross-section of society chosen at random, so all around the country, people drawn out like a jury service essentially. And they are put into a room, and in this room they work together, they collaborate, and they deliberate, they discuss. That's one of the things. They don't confront each other across the aisles of the Houses of Parliament. They don't harangue and shout at each other. They don't get entangled up because they can't say this, otherwise they're not going to get elected. They don't get tangled up because their bosses in the fossil fuel industry are putting pressure on them or donating their part to their party. No, these are ordinary people like my neighbour, the guy down the shop, someone who works, probably maybe even people in the room who work in the fossil fuel industry. Who would be in that room, but the point is they would be receiving input and advice and information, basically from experts in these fields that are most important. Engineering, scientists, all sorts of different experts in their fields would give people the possibilities in the given situation, and then these ordinary people would come together and work out which bits to blend together. And people say often, what about these ordinary people? What if they're not very clever or whatever? That is rubbish. I believe people are clever, given a sense of responsibility. When we have a jury, very often, and I'm not saying this is true all the time by any means, but we believe, and I think, that ordinary people, when given a responsibility, they step up. And ordinary people coming together would make better decisions on ordinary people's behalf than our leaders, who are selected from a very, very small pool of people, somewhat disconnected from the day-to-day life of a lot of people. For example, and I'm not just saying, there's lots of examples. For example, our Chancellor Rishi Sunak. I don't think it can be said that he's kind of one of people like you and I. It doesn't seem like that. He is, anyway, I'm not going to go down there. But ordinary people are going to be in charge of making what's called a just transition, a fair transition. So this is a very rapid change of our economy from a carbon-intensive, carbon-fueled economy to another sort of economy, a sustainable green economy, if you will. But it's not my plan. They're not going to listen to me or anyone from Extinction Rebellion particularly. They're going to listen to experts, and the experts are going to tell it like it is, rather than having like slogans and trying to dissolve a whole massive problem down into a few words that you can fit on the side of a bus. Yeah, this is going to be serious, careful thinking, and then the policies that come out of that will hopefully be more appropriate for ordinary people. And because for example, I saw during the COVID pandemic, our government sprang out to respond, blah blah blah. Whether they did a good job or bad job, it's history will tell. But one thing they certainly did do was they gave emergency contracts to people they knew, and some of the people that they knew and their buddies made an absolute killing out of it and did very little in return. And so even if our government suddenly just flipped itself one day and said, right, we're going to do a green economy, I wouldn't trust them, because they don't do things. They look after their friends, and they look after the people who are far too close to our policies, to our government. So that's why I want this Citizens' Assembly. So that is the demand. That is, if you will, our solution. That is a solution I want. There are all sorts of different things we can do, but ordinary people will blend all these together into a way that works, and that's what we want. And it's proven. You can look these up. There's been examples of Citizens' Assemblies all around the world, and they have proven to be actually very sensible. We even had a Citizens' Assembly in this country that came up with very sensible recommendations that our government basically ignored. So that is the kind of why, I suppose. Why did I do this? To disrupt this fossil fuel machine. And I called it on the press, it's a death machine. This fossil fuel industry is destroying life on Earth. It is a death machine. And these cogs that are just turning and turning every day, we need to slow these down. And there are some very brave people out there who are fighting, and they're trying to get themselves into those cogs just to gum them up just for a little while. And let's be honest as well, we're rebels in this country. But for example, a company like Shell operating in the Niger Delta on the lands of the Ogoni tribe. The people who are living in the Niger Delta, these Ogoni people, have been battling Shell, and it's kind of, Shell, as it's on the record, have been proven to be associated with some very unsavoury people, and they've been murdered and tortured, persecuted, and these companies are not out of the sight of many of us. These companies are really, really brutal, and they are battling. People out there are battling for their lives. They're dealing with oil spills. They're trying to deal with a government that's being corrupted by these companies, Shell. And again, it's been shown that Shell have paid loads and loads of money to people in governments to be able to do what they do in these countries. So round and around, these companies, they are not our friends. And people might call me a criminal, but actually, and I may well be found to be a criminal yet, I don't know. But what is really, really criminal is people who know the harm that their business is doing, spend millions to hide it, spend millions to keep it going and stoke it and keep going with it, and they know the harm they're doing, yet no one seems to be holding them to account. So I'd say that, to me, is criminal behaviour. Anyway, so let me come on to another part of my talk here. So people ask, why now? Why? We're in the middle of a war in Ukraine. People are worried about nuclear annihilation. Why now? We're in the middle of a price crisis because we are, people are struggling to heat their homes. So I kind of come to both of those things, I suppose. For me, both of those things point in one direction. They point in a few different directions, but they both point clearly in one direction at least, which is that our lives are over-reliant on fossil fuels. Both of them, fossil fuels are feeding the war in Ukraine. It is clear that Vladimir Putin wouldn't be where he is, wouldn't have the leverage that he has without his stranglehold on fossil fuels, which in turn have a hold on us. Another interesting fact, since the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Shell have ploughed £8 billion into the Russian economy. And, £8 billion, that's an average of £1 billion a year since they invaded Crimea. So since it was very clear that Russia were, prepared to do things that, internationally are frowned upon and are not good things, £8 billion, £1 billion a year has gone into Russia, and that's funding the war. That's funding the bullets that tear through Ukrainian people's bodies. That's the bombs and shells that rain down on them and destroy their lives, their infrastructure, their towns, their cities, everything. That's not cool. So that's pointing to that. The cost of living crisis, the cost of living crisis is also pointing to the fact that we are over-reliant on fossil fuels. These companies have created a price panic, and some people call this, it shouldn't be called a cost of living crisis, it should be called a cost of living scandal, because it has been preventable for a long time, many years now. Our government has not taken the steps that it could do to reduce the impact of this crisis right now, this scandal. They could have invested far more heavily in renewables, which would reduce our exposure to these fluctuations. They could have started this massive retrofitting scheme to allow people to use less energy, and again to have to use less of their money to heat their homes. So our governments have not done this. And the other thing is that these companies are turning an absolutely huge profit, and it is basically a price panic that they've created. They have been saying, we're not sure if we're going to have enough money to supply, the gas and all that you need. And they'd be like, hold on, then we got to buy some. And then the price goes up, and oh my word, people, there's not going to be enough if everyone buys it. And the price goes up and up and up. They've just bid up their prices. And the huge proportion on our bills is to do with the profits that they're making. There's the green levies. These are a small amount. The main thing is that as the prices have gone up, they've protected their profits, and then as the prices increase, they've passed that on to their customers, and so they've made huge amounts of money out of it, and that's totally wrong. So again, right now it's never a good time to do disruptive protests, but right now it is important that we call out and draw attention to the fact that